The film, based on real events, tells the story of the actions of American soldiers during the Vietnam War in 1966. The scouts are tasked with finding and destroying underground tunnels used by enemies to travel underground and strike behind American lines. Having moved to the operations site at night, the soldiers are hiding in the forest when they suddenly hear mortar fire. Realizing that it is nearby and the enemy has discovered one of the groups, the scouts shoot at the enemy, trying to suppress resistance. Lieutenant Riley asks to determine the location of the Viet Cong and transmit their coordinates, focusing on the sounds of gunfire. Noticing one of the enemies, the soldier opens fire to kill. This reveals the scout's position, causing the enemy to begin bombarding the American soldiers with mortar fire. Some try to escape, while others fall victim to shelling and lose their lives. Mark Erickson was a private first class who was on patrol away from the scouts. The frightened guy decides to run, but accidentally falls underground, getting stuck in the enemy's secret tunnel. The aircraft, having received the coordinates, launches a massive missile strike. A few minutes later, soldiers survey the area, counting casualties and providing medical care to the wounded. Mark is unable to escape the trap, unaware that the Viet Cong who have spotted him are approaching with a knife in his teeth. Sergeant Meserve notices Mark and helps him out of the hole before an armed enemy attacks him. Another enemy, hiding in a tree, fires at the soldiers. The sergeant uses tracer bullets to pinpoint his location, after which Mark fires a grenade launcher, eliminating the enemy. The Viet Cong who was hunting the soldier crawls out of the hole with a machine gun in his hands, but the sergeant acts faster and takes his life. In the morning, the surviving scouts stop at a small village, using it as a temporary shelter. Mark is kind to the local kids, but other soldiers do not trust them, believing that even a child here is capable of meanness and could turn out to be a terrorist. The sergeant and his colleagues consider the local population to be potential traitors, but Mark is convinced otherwise and proves himself to be a polite and attentive soldier. Sometime later, Meserve and Brownie remind the soldiers that they must obey the sergeants and obediently follow all their orders. Very soon, Meserve and Brownie will be demobilized, so young people should follow their example while they have the opportunity. At the same moment, several Viet Cong hiding in the bushes fire at the American soldiers, seriously wounding Brownie. The forces are unequal, but the scouts manage to win, forcing the enemy to retreat. A little later, medical helicopters arrive in the village to evacuate the wounded. Corporal Clark is not surprised, but extremely outraged by what happened. He understands that it is not for nothing that he does not trust the locals and dreams of burning them if such an order were received. The next morning, the soldiers return to base to rest and prepare for a new mission. Meserve reports that Sergeant Brownie passed away because the wound was too serious. In the evening, the scouts must study the nearby area, and in the morning, they will go on a forced march. Having announced his plans, Meserve decides to go to the nearest village to find a girl for relaxation and entertainment. In the evening, 4 soldiers try to leave the military base to go to a local village, but a patrolman forbids them to go beyond the restricted area. Desperate, the soldiers return to the barracks. Sergeant Meserve also arrives here and introduces his subordinates to Private Antonio, who replaced the late Brownie. Having explained the route and announced the assigned tasks, Meserve suggests setting out a couple of hours earlier in order to go into a village along the way and steal some beautiful girl. Mark is shocked by the sergeant's criminal statement, but the corporal calms him down, writing it all off as a ridiculous joke. A little later, the soldiers move to the site of the combat mission, but as Meserve promised, they visit a neighboring village. After checking every house, they find a charming girl, Oan, deciding to captivate her. The village begins to scream and panic, and the mother asks to leave her daughter alone. Having dirtily used the girl's sister, the scouts take Oan away. Mark is shocked by what is happening and did not think that his comrades could commit a war crime. But he cannot influence the current situation in any way. Having kidnapped Oan for pleasure and entertainment, The American soldiers continue to move according to a pre-planned route. Mark condemns the sergeant for the crime he committed, but he does not feel any pangs of conscience. Ignoring the conscientious private, Meserve sends him on patrol. Corporal Clark and Private Hatcher do not consider their action bad, since soldiers need entertainment. Having made a stop, they decide to spend time in the company of a tied-up girl, but notice moving bushes. Assuming that enemies are hiding there, the soldiers open fire, but it turns out that it is just a lost animal. Mark again tries to talk with Meserve and understand the reason for their terrible act. But the sergeant deceives him, finding a ridiculous excuse for the kidnapping. The young soldier understands that the senior man is manipulating terms, calling anyone who does not obey him an enemy and a traitor. Moreover, Meserve can accuse him of treason by using weapons against his own subordinate. Not wanting to start shooting, which could attract the attention of enemies, the group continues moving. A couple of hours later, a group of scouts stops near an abandoned wooden house hidden deep in the forest. The sergeant, corporal, and Private Hatcher go to reconnoiter the area while the captive cleans up the house under the supervision of Mark and Diaz. The second soldier also does not understand what is happening and does not want to use the girl against her will. Mark and Diaz find a common language and decide to stand up for each other in order to prevent their colleagues from committing a crime. Afterwards, Mark helps Owen treat her wounds, gaining her trust and sympathy. Soon, Meserve, Clark, and Hatcher return to the house to have fun with the criminal. The sergeant suggests starting with an interrogation with passion, tying up Owen, after which he determines the order in which the soldiers will have fun with her. Mark speaks out against this, resulting in an armed conflict between his colleagues. Meserve is ready to accuse Mark of betrayal as soon as he does not want to spend time with a beautiful girl. The soldier hopes that Diaz will support him, but the guy chickened out at the last moment and joined the others. Clark diffuses the tense situation and sends Mark on patrol so that he does not interfere with others spending time with the captive. Meserve is the first to go to a dilapidated wooden house and throws the girl on the table, tearing off everything unnecessary from her. Mark hears the girl moan, cry, and scream, realizing that the sergeant decided to have fun with her. The guy can't believe that his co-workers turned out to be real scoundrels and feels terrible about his inability to help Owen. Mark did not help the unfortunate girl in any way, but became the only one who did not take advantage of her, maintaining his humanity and loyalty to his principles. The next morning, the group sets out on reconnaissance, leaving Clark at the house to look after the captive. Nearby, American soldiers notice a group of armed enemies transporting shells. Continuing observation, the sergeant transmits the coordinates to headquarters, preparing to carry out the remaining combat missions. Realizing that they need smoke grenades, the two soldiers return to the house. The corporal doesn't want to be Owen's watchdog and orders Mark to stay with the girl instead. As soon as the colleagues leave, the guy unties the exhausted village girl, giving her some food and water. Having learned that Mark remained with the captive, Meserve orders to return to the makeshift camp, realizing that the young guy might make a mistake. The sergeant turned out to be right, since Mark wanted to let the girl go and decided to help her return to the village. Clark accuses the soldier of desertion, threatening execution for attempting to desert his comrades, and forces the pair to join the group. The sergeant is constantly nervous as Owen cooks and may attract the attention of the Viet Cong. Meserve orders Mark to get rid of the girl, but he is not ready to carry out the criminal order. Diaz decides to do it instead, but the private shoots into the air, which attracts the attention of armed enemies. Having discovered the American soldiers, the Viet Cong open fire to kill. A firefight begins, during which the scouts retreat, leaving only Mark in the position. Moving along the railway, they notice aircraft and realize that help is already close. Taking advantage of the confusion, the corporal decides to get rid of Owen and stabs the girl in the stomach, but she survives. Mark tries to stop the horror happening, but the sergeant orders to get rid of the girl as soon as possible. If anyone finds out what they did, they will be court-martialed. Fearing this, Mark's colleagues shoot at the girl, taking her life. The sergeant and his subordinates retreat, leaving the private on the railway, where he sees the disfigured body of Owen lying below and an airstrike that destroyed the enemy. A few days later, Mark wakes up in a military hospital and tells an old friend about all the horrors that happened during the combat mission. Rowan is shocked and suggests contacting Lieutenant Riley, since only the commander can understand what happened. Mark listens to his comrade, but is faced with the complete indifference of the lieutenant, who suggests forgetting about this incident. To prevent Mark and other scouts from interfering, Riley decides to disband the battle group, sending the fighters to different units. Sometime later, the soldier meets his comrade again and tells about the lieutenant's terrible decision. A recruit intrudes into their conversation, but a minute later he steps on a mine and loses his life. Mark and Rowan feel guilty because they drove the guy away, which led to a terrible accident. Looking at this, the private realizes that he cannot sit idly by and decides to make public the crime against the unfortunate Owen. Having met with Captain Hill, the guy realizes that everyone is aware and knows about what happened, but continues to do nothing. Moreover, the captain asks Mark not to talk about this with anyone, since his colleagues may take revenge and will start with his family. At night, the private goes to the smoking room, not realizing that he is being watched. Hatcher accidentally notices a corporal who has decided to get rid of Mark, a drunk. Hatcher runs into the barracks, and the corporal throws a grenade into the smoking room. Despite having only a second to make a decision, Mark manages to jump out of the building, remaining unharmed. Realizing who is behind this, Mark takes a shovel and goes to the barracks. Having attacked his former colleagues, he knocks out Clark and reports that senior management knows about what happened but did not react to the situation in any way, so they have nothing to fear. A little later, Mark goes to the bar to have a drink, and for a while forget about the horror that happened in the house in the forest. After drinking too much, the private meets Captain Kirk. The military man and part-time priest is ready to listen to Mark, who is ready to confess due to his depressed state and constant stress. The private reports that he is being transferred to another combat unit, but not because he is a bad soldier, but because of an attempt to achieve justice. Mark talks about how 4 colleagues kidnapped a young girl from the village, after which they held him captive, abused and used her, and then took her life to cover up her tracks. Having influence, Captain Kirk tells the relevant authorities about all this, which leads to the start of a judicial investigation. During the investigation, the commission finds the body of the unfortunate girl and invites those responsible for the incident for questioning. As a result of the court tribunal, 4 American intelligence officers were sentenced to hard labor, receiving a fair punishment. Sergeant Meserve is sent to prison for 10 years, Hatcher for 15, and Clark is sentenced to life imprisonment. Diaz committed the crime under duress, so he received 8 years in prison. In the present time, Mark is riding a tram and notices a charming Vietnamese girl who looks like Owen. Noticing that she has dropped her handkerchief, the former soldier hurries after her, but realizes that he has made a mistake. Having come to his senses, Mark realizes that the whole past is behind him and he has restored justice, doing everything to ensure that the criminals receive punishment.